Hi, and welcome to English 4, Lesson 1.1 Structure Analysis of Nonfiction Texts. So, nonfiction here, of course, means not fake. Fiction, fake, it's made up. It's the stories you read about, people who don't actually exist. Nonfiction is all about reality. So, we have to basically talk about essays here. Nonfiction texts usually come in the form of essays and articles. So we're going to talk about the introduction, the body, and the conclusion. There's a lot for body. Conclusion. And it can be summed up in this phrase. Oh, down here. Tell them what you're going to say. Tell them what you need to say. And then tell them what you just said. And that comes in the form of the intro, the body, and the conclusion. Now, is that repetitive? Absolutely. Repetition is a good thing in an essay. In a conversation, it can be kind of annoying, but in an essay, it really drives your point home and lets it stick in the memory of the reader. So the essay they want us to analyze the structure of is called The Civil Rights Movement by Alexis Coulada. So the best thing to do here is to read through the essay once just to read it, and then go back and reread it for the analysis. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to read it first, and then we're going to go back through and look at the structure. Okay. The Civil Rights Movement was one of the most important movements in American history. It was organized in response to racial inequalities for African Americans in the later years of the 19th century. It reached a dynamic period between the 1950s and 1960s as its efforts began to achieve political and social reforms. The successes of civil rights pioneers encouraged others to keep fighting for racial equality in the following generations. The origins of the civil rights movement can be traced to the 1860s. The abolition of slavery after the Civil War seemed to promise equality to all African Americans. Soon, though, many states and local governments began to pass laws, known as Jim Crow laws, which maintained racial inequality and upheld segregation. These discriminatory acts worsened over the early decades of the 19th century. United States President Harry Truman tried to improve equality in the military in 1948 by signing his Executive Order 9981, which stated that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. Citation, Executive Order. By that point, though, tensions had reached an apex. The following decade reflected this intensity, with an increasing number of both setbacks and successes. The year 1954, for example, marked the verdict of the Brown v. Board of Education trial. The trial reinforced the need for equal access to education by mandating the desegregation of schools in more than 20 states. Citation, We Shall Overcome, Brown v. Board of Education. The subsequent year, a daring African-American seamstress named Rosa Parks defied a bus driver's order in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat in the seating reserved for white riders. Parks's rebellion resulted in her arrest and cost her in fines and fees. It also launched the Montgomery bus boycott, which endured for more than a year and contributed to a Supreme Court decision to outlaw racial segregation on buses. Citation, Ship. All right, I'm going to stop for a second and take this opportunity to show you what citations do. So this person doesn't just know about the Montgomery bus boycotts. This isn't just coming from their head. This is coming from their reading. And they read something by somebody named Ship. And let's say you're reading this and you go, okay, I don't care about the rest of it as much as I care about this. The Montgomery bus boycotts. I need to know more about this. Where do I find the thing you read? Well, you take this Ship, you go down to the bottom of the article to Works Cited, see Works Cited, and then find, here's Dalek, here's King, here's Lambert, ship. This is the books. Rosa Parks, 92, founding symbol of civil rights movement, died. The New York Times, that means it's from the newspaper, the New York Times, and it was published in 2005. And here is a link to the article. If you happen to be reading this on a computer, you can just copy and paste that link and go read it. So that's what citations are for. It's to prove that you've done research and to let somebody who's reading your article look into the things you read for further information. Okay, so let's go back to one of the key voices of the Montgomery bus boycott was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a young Baptist minister who built upon his efforts in Montgomery to become a leading figure of the civil rights movement. Over the late 1950s and early 1960s, Dr. King Jr. organized nonviolent means of protests. These included marches and sit-ins to emphasize the need for equal rights without using anger or hostility. His hope for equality for all was perhaps best captured in his moving speech, "I Have a Dream," which he prepared for his landmark March on Washington in 1963. As he spoke near the close of his oration, "I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up, live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." Citation King Jr. 4. That means it's on page 4 of the citation. If you go and read the whole thing, it'll be on page 4. Though figures like Dr. King Jr. stressed the need for nonviolent retaliation, their efforts were often met with hostility. For example, the march organized by Dr. King Jr. from Selma to Montgomery in 1965 ended in violent outbursts and hostile attacks against peaceful marchers. Dr. King Jr. would later be assassinated in 1968, a violent act that was in direct contrast to his lifelong message of peace and tolerance. As the story of key figures like Dr. King Jr. illustrates, participation in the fight for civil rights was not easy and could result in bodily harm or even death. By the mid-1960s, however, these risky efforts began to yield results. In 1962, for instance, African-American Air Force veteran James H. Meredith successfully won his administration to the University of Mississippi. The university initially wanted to deny him entry because of his race, but the Supreme Court ruled in Meredith's favor, Lambert 58. In October 1962, despite protests and retaliation, Meredith enrolled and completed his college degree late the next year. Soon after Meredith's success, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 made it illegal for individuals to discriminate against anyone because of their race, gender, or religion. It passed thanks to the efforts of the United States President Lyndon B. Johnson and became a new benchmark for legal reform in the name of equality, Dalek 169. President Johnson's follow-up Voting Rights Act of 1965 called for similarly equal access for all those who wish to vote, Voting Rights Act. These successes of the civil rights movement validated much of the effort made in the decades prior to enhance equality. More work is to be done. The key figures of the civil rights movement, however, have inspired many to keep fighting for the rights of all Americans deserve. Okay, so we've read it once. Pretty easy read. Only took, 8 minutes? And then we go back and we look. So the first thing we want to look for is a thesis statement. A thesis statement is a statement of what the entire article is supposed to be about. The civil rights movement was one of the most important movements in American history. Is probably our best bet for the thesis statement. It raises the question, what is the civil rights movement? Why was it important? And then that leaves the rest of the body to answer those two questions. What was it and why was it important? Let's look in the first paragraph for a topic sentence. The origins of the civil rights movement can be traced to the 1860s. Is a good topic sentence for this paragraph. Because here in this first paragraph, they said that it happened in the 50s and 60s. The 1950s, 1960s. So then why would the 1860s be the origin of it? That's 100 years before. And then they immediately tell you about slavery and Jim Crow laws and all those things. So what I want you to pick up on is that everything you do, you're doing for one purpose. You have to develop your purpose first, and then structure everything around that. So let's say you were writing an essay about movies and which movie is the best movie. You would first decide which movie you're going to defend, and then, because when you're talking about movies, it is defending. People are going to attack your opinion. So you've got to make that decision first, and then you've got to come up with a bunch of points as to why that movie is good. You don't start writing the essay yet. You write out all the points of, like for me, I'm going to say Avengers Endgame. Let's go over here. I would say Avengers Endgame. That's not how you spell that. And then I would come up with points. It's the culmination of 10 years of movies. It's got an epic fight scene. It's got well-developed characters. It's got good jokes. I'd come up with all these points, and then I would start developing them further and change each one into a paragraph. And then each time I made a point, I would support it with, say, a quote from the movie or an article somebody else wrote, so that I have some other authority to cite. And so this is basically the beginnings of an outline. You outline your intro, your body, and your conclusion. You come up with all your ideas, and then you would start writing. You don't start writing right away and then try to figure out what your essay is about as you write it. You figure it out first, and then everything else follows. Okay, so that'll do it for now. I'll meet you in... Well, let's look. Hold up. Author's purpose and tone, finding central ideas in a passage. Okay, we did central ideas by looking at that essay in the Civil Rights Movement. Purpose and tone. Tone. That is not something we addressed yet. The purpose, of course, is to purpose of the Civil Rights Movement was to inform. Was to inform the audience about the Civil Rights Movement, what it was in general terms, and where you can find more information about it. The tone, let's see, civil reform, equality, segregation, no, that's just like a thing. The tone is what the person sounds like. Are they critical of the Civil Rights Movement, or are they supportive of it? Well, they clearly were supportive of it. Were they objective or highly opinionated? I think they were fairly objective. They just told you things about it as though it were fact because these things happened, and they didn't put on any of their own personal opinion. Respectful, I would call their tone respectful of a great historical movement. They didn't make light of it. They didn't make any jokes. Their tone could be called respectful, objective, and informative. Does that make sense? Let's see. Summary of the decline of Detroit. I'm not going to read that whole thing because this video is already 15 minutes long. Oh, this is just a summary of it. It's not even a whole article. The more you write summaries, the easier it will be. Okay, I guess they ask you to write a summary of it. We're not asking you to do that here, and the end of lesson 1 is a test, not an essay. So I guess just understand how to condense the entire idea of an essay down into a couple of sentences. And we'll be done.